Hello and welcome to the Unit 3 review PowerPoint. This PowerPoint and lecture accompanying it is going to cover, to some extent, the textbook notes that were in this unit. It's going to look at the 3 class readings that cover the different regions of the world, which is kind of what this unit is all about. The idea that the world pre-Columbus, pre-European Age of Exploration, is separated into regions that have really no contact with each other. So the first of those regions is Australia and the Pacific Islands, and that region is covered by the Yawley's People article. The second region is the Americas, which is covered by the Charles Mann excerpt writing Wheels and Bucket Brigades. And the third region is Africa, Europe, and Asia, which is all connected, the largest of those land masses, which is covered by Southernization, which is the most sort of complicated and fruitful reading, I think, and is one that I would definitely recommend rereading before the AP test, or at least going back through the notes about that reading. The 2 labs in this unit were a little bit strange. The first one was about human migrations, and the second one was looking at maps and cartography, so we'll glance over those as well. Yawley's People is a really key reading in certain ways in that it pushes us back to the very beginning of the year when we were talking about the origins of agriculture in the world and the switch from hunter-gatherer lifestyles to agricultural lifestyles. And the key piece of this is that you can almost do a study in how agriculture gets passed from society to society by looking at what transpired in New Guinea and Australia. And what happened is New Guinea was fairly suitable for farming, and so farming spread there, but it wasn't transferred across this small body of water to Australia. And Jared Diamond has some theories about that. And one of the things he's trying to do in this text, which is an excerpt from Guns, Germs, and Steel, is he's trying to say, hey, these old racist theories about these people being inferior aren't really accurate. What's accurate to say is that geography and climate and the availability of things to domesticate and the knowledge of farming just didn't pass very easily to Australia. And so he brings up a bunch of key points about the climate of Australia, about how the soil wasn't particularly fertile, about how there aren't any easily domesticatable mammals there, large mammals like horses, cattle, the sort of stuff that you need to do really good agriculture with. And that there's a really high degree of isolation. He even brings up the point of Tasmania about how Tasmania was so isolated that the people there lost some of the technology that they had prior to traveling by boat to Tasmania, and they got sort of stuck there. So ultimately, the moral of this reading is that as a human society, it's dangerous to be isolated. You may not have much of a choice about it, but it's hard to progress without interactions with other groups of people. And Australia is a really good example of this. And the counterexample would be societies in Eurasia that develop really quickly and have tons and tons of cultural, technological interactions with each other. History lab number 4 was all about human migrations, and we looked at these language maps of Africa and Oceania in the Pacific. We looked at climate maps, we looked at wind and current maps of the Pacific, with the goal of trying to figure out how people spread from place to place. And this is actually how historians do it. They piece together a lot about human migrations from cultural artifacts, and language is one of the really powerful cultural artifacts that remains in societies over time that allows us to trace where people came from and where they moved to. The big first piece of this is in terms of African history. The Bantu group of people who spoke these Bantu language groups spread out and replaced all sorts of other hunter-gatherer peoples in Africa. And the reason they were able to do that is, again, because of farming. And the reason that they had to do that was in part because of farming. Farming essentially allows you to grow much bigger populations of people, as we talked about in Unit 1, and that leads to technological complexity, it leads to political complexity, it leads to all sorts of interesting societies, and those societies tend to spread out because as you have more people, all the new people need somewhere to go. And those societies also tend to take over and wipe out hunter-gatherer societies. And that's what we think happened in Africa. over the last 2,000 years or so, this Bantu group in West Africa spread out and gradually took over all the land that had been previously used by other groups, anywhere that it was suitable for farming. So this didn't really happen in Central Africa in the rainforest, but it happened in South Africa and parts of East Africa. There's also some pastoralist groups that still remain in southern Africa. And of course, in the Sahara Desert, it's a little bit different. So the maps of language, when compared to the maps of climate, show that the language groups and the climate groups overlap to a good extent. And the reason for this is that it's hard for people to change their lifestyles to accommodate a different climate. We also looked at Oceania and we saw similar things in certain ways. Overpopulated islands in the Pacific forced people to migrate to new locations, and the Polynesians were incredibly expert canoe makers, boat makers. They were able to navigate really precisely by the stars. They were able to find land before they could even see it based on patterns of migratory birds. It's pretty remarkable stuff. And so by about the year, I think about 1,000, 1,200, somewhere in there, they had colonized basically every inhabitable piece of land in the Pacific. And to go back to the Yawley's people slide for just a second, we see some of the same exact consequences of the really isolated groups as we do of Australians, in that people, for example, on Easter Island were so far away from everything else that they suffered some of the cultural losses or technological losses and eventual population losses that weren't true of places that were more connected. The final piece of this is that this lab really pushes the idea that environmental factors play a big part in how people migrate, but people also change these environments pretty dramatically. Farmers have a really profound effect upon the land that they settle because they cut down forests, they create fields, they domesticate animals, they push out certain wild animals, other things move in that can live in those areas really well. And so humans have a really tremendous impact upon the places that they live. The second reading in this unit was Riding Wheels and Bucket Brigades. And one of the intentions of this is to highlight the ways in which American societies develop differently from Eurasian societies, but also some of the similarities between them, because they're not nearly as different as you might think they would be. Some of the similarities involve governments. I think that you find in both Eurasia and in the Americas these big centralized government bureaucracies wherever you find lots of intensified farming. So in Eurasia, you find that in China, you find that in India, you find that in and around the Mediterranean, the Middle East, in Europe, Northern Africa. You find that in Western Africa as well. Anywhere you can do a lot of farming, you find these interesting, complex societies. And then you also find that in the Americas, in Central America, sort of modern day Mexico, where the Aztec Empire and a bunch of earlier groups were. And you also find that in the Andes mountain regions, where the Incan Empire ended up. These governments need certain things to run well. So they need bureaucracies, they need systems of written language, which again, a lot of these American societies had. The one where we're a little unsure about is the Incan societies, which had this really interesting rope language where they would make knots and ropes to keep track of things. It's not clear exactly how much information could be conveyed by this language. You have cultural practices often designed to keep people invested in the political structure, so the religion and the politics works together to keep people obeying rules and following orders. You have lots of examples of human sacrifice in religious traditions in the Americas. You have social structures that differentiate roles in society, obviously, in all of these places. So in some big picture ways, in terms of culture and politics and social structures, the Americas and Africa and Eurasia don't really look all that different. They look wildly different from hunter-gatherer societies in Australia that are in these much smaller tribal structures that don't have a centralized rule. However, the Americas have two big pieces missing that were present in Eurasia and which explain why Eurasia conquered the Americas. The first big thing that's missing is domesticated mammals. And because there's no big domesticatable mammals in the Americas, you end up not having those mammals to help you with agriculture. You also don't have the same sort of trade because you don't have animals to pull carts. You're not using the wheel in the same way. There's all these examples of indigenous American societies using the wheel as toys, but not for transport, because why would you? You have nothing to pull the thing that has wheels. But even more importantly, perhaps, diseases basically exist because people were living in close proximity to animals that they domesticated. And diseases would make the jump, say, from your cows or your chickens or your pigs to people. And then the people would get them and pass them along, and then the people would get immunities to them or develop resistance to them. In the Americas, this just wasn't happening to the same extent it was happening in Eurasia. So, virtually all of the world's really, really nasty, horrible, very contagious diseases were brought from Eurasia to the Americas with really devastating consequences that we'll look at in Unit 5 again. Then there's the final point that these trade networks in the Americas were just not as usable. They just weren't as long distance as those in Eurasia. Jared Diamond has a theory about this where he says that because it was a north-south sort of orientation of the continents, that you couldn't bring things that would be successful in the places you were bringing them because the climate wasn't the same. Because you were going north-south where the seasons were a little bit different and you didn't have the same sort of climate for growing and planting things. And there were also some ecological barriers. North and South America are connected by a very, very thin strip of land in Panama, and it's rainforest, and it's treacherous and hard to get around. And the Andes Mountains aren't so easy to get around, and you don't have horses. So there's a lot of limitations to trade that just weren't present in Eurasia. Onward to Lab 5. This is the kind of weirdest lab of the course, I would say. I think there's some interesting things to be got out of this. The maps that we looked at, and we looked at 6 different maps that all tried to catalog the known world. Um, these maps really show us the limitations of human knowledge, of how much people in Eurasia knew about the world around them. They showed trade routes. They showed a real accurate focus of the place where they were located. If you look back to the map that was made in Korea, you can see that the outlines of the Korean peninsula are just incredibly detailed, whereas their knowledge of, say, Africa is really vague and sort of only partially looks like the Africa as we know it. Same thing is true of the Mediterranean. All these maps that are made of the Mediterranean show that beautiful outline between North Africa and Europe, but they don't do a very good job at all of showing what China looks like or India, and most of them up until the last map don't have the Americas at all. It's important to note that these maps served as decorative pieces, as kind of symbols of knowledge or culture, more than they were used really as navigational tools. And there's also this really interesting thing where you can see how scientific knowledge progressed to a certain point. By the Ptolemaic map made during the time of the ancient Greeks, they had enough information to make a pretty good map of the Mediterranean, one that holds up pretty well today. But there's no real improvement of that map for many, many, many years. And it's only until you get to the point of Columbus and the age of exploration that European maps really start to improve again and get substantially better than they were, say, 1,000 years before. Before we jump into the last reading about Southernization, I just want to talk about trade networks and define a few things quickly. If we're talking about Eurasia, there's basically 2 main trade networks. There's the Indian Ocean Network, and that's all done by shipping, by boats, ships, and it's reliant upon the monsoon winds. And the monsoon winds blow one way in one season and the other way in the next season, and they allow you to go both directions. Once people had mastered these things with new technology, things like the Lantine sail and the compass are really crucial to this, that allowed sailors to navigate away from the coastline and it allowed for huge amounts of commerce to go on in the Indian Ocean. And it connected some interesting points of the world. It connected India, connected the Spice Islands in Southeast Asia, it connected China, and it connected the Middle East and East Africa. So everything that borders the Indian Ocean got this benefit of this trade. And that's why you end up with these city-states in East Africa. That's why you end up with this massive commercial production throughout southern Asia. The other big trade route is the Silk Roads, which peaked at two different points in history. Its kind of peak use was during first the Roman Empire and Han Dynasty, so we're talking about 2,000 years ago. And its second peak use was during the Mongol Empire, so there we're talking about 800 years ago. The Silk Road is a little trickier because everything had to be taken by horses and carts and things like that. So you actually couldn't travel with as heavy of items just because it's a lot more effort. It's a lot easier to ship that stuff than to take it over land. The other really key trade route is the Trans-Saharan route that was really started because of the domestication of the camel and the invention of the camel saddle. And that allowed Arab groups in the Middle East to travel down through the Sahara Desert into sub-Saharan Africa, and it connected the kingdoms of like Mali and Ghana and those kingdoms in West Africa with the core civilization groups in the Mediterranean. That trade was also in some ways really treacherous, but as you can imagine, people were making quite a bit of profit off of this stuff. They were willing to do it because these trips often took months, sometimes years on end to get stuff back and forth. And when we're talking about analyzing trade, the best way to do it is to think about it as a network that focuses around a central area or a trade hub, you could call it, where everything passes through. And historically, before we get to the connection of the Americas and the global trade network, in this pre-Columbian time, the hubs of the trade are the Middle East and India for the most part. Those are the places where all this trade goes through, depending on what network you're talking about. And then there's the folks who are on the outside of the trade networks, who are on the very outskirts of it, and that's what you would call the periphery. And they get much less benefit out of the trade. It just doesn't end up being quite as useful for them. So I should just tell you to reread Southernization, which I've already done once in this video, and you really should reread it because there's no real way to summarize it or capture all the information in here. And there is always, 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 you'll see on the next slide, some AP question about trade routes. And Southernization captures a lot of the important stuff about trade routes and connects it to the major political entities that were profiting off these trade routes or that were dependent on them to get the luxury goods that they needed, wanted, allowed them to have social stratification. Southernization begins by talking about Asia. It talks about this cultural efflorescence, which is just basically another way of saying a golden age that's going on in the Mauryan and Gupta empires in India before and after the birth of Christ. And it talks about how the crystallization of sugar is really crucial. There's incredible production of cotton and cotton textiles in India at this time. Buddhism is another thing that gets spread through the trade networks. Mathematics, the Indian numeral system, the idea of the number zero, all these spices, these things are all like going through India, being produced in India, moving out into China, into the Middle East. Hugely important as a starting point for the idea that the stuff that was being produced and invented and the ideas of the global South are moving out from Southern Asia into the rest of the world. China reaps a lot of benefits here. Talk about the Chinese Golden Age often centers on these three dynasties, the Sui, Tang, and Song dynasties. And those three last from about 500 CE to about 1250 or so. And those dynasties show huge amounts of production in China. Champa rice, which is important, gets moved up from Southeast Asia into China, and it allows the population to boom because you can grow it more frequently. It's more productive. You get the invention of the compass in China. You get all sorts of new kind of inside Chinese trade networks. The Grand Canal is built, connecting the two major rivers in China. So all this stuff's really important, obviously. Historians talk about how China was on the verge of industrializing, having an industrial revolution like 700 years before Britain did, but wasn't quite able to do it. They were producing all sorts of iron. They just didn't have the coal supplies in the right place, is what historians think. but a really, really important time for China. The Middle East is also going through this cultural efflorescence. This is the time of the Islamic caliphates, the Umayyad, and then the Abbasid caliphates. The Islamic caliphates have taken over North Africa and Spain and the Middle East and a good chunk of Eastern Europe in the process. And they are profiting immensely from this trade because it's all going through the Middle East to get to Europe or to get to Africa. So they are really a key hub here. Europe is kind of locked out of this trade. And actually, there's a really important thing that happens in 1453, which is that the Byzantine Empire collapses. The Ottoman Empire essentially takes over the city of Constantinople and renames it Istanbul. And that cuts off Europe from their last Christian entryway into the trade. And it allows the Ottoman Empire to basically decide what items get to go through and how much they cost. And that jumpstarts the European age of exploration that gets us to Columbus and really reshapes the way the world worked. And it's all because Europeans were desperately trying to find new ways to get into this trade network that didn't force them to go through these middlemen in the Ottoman Empire. But to step back a little bit, that happens in the 1450s. Before all of this happens, the Mongol Empire shows up, and this is in the last maybe half of the reading or last third of this reading. And it talks about how the Mongol Empire reshapes trade routes by moving the Silk Roads north and then by turning the Silk Roads into a profit making sort of enterprise. Basically, they create a passport system, they police the Silk Roads to get rid of criminals and raiders and that sorts of things. They put in way stations for people to stop as they're going from place to place. And the Mongol Empire really makes a ton of profit by taxing all of the trade that's going on the Silk Road. They want all this stuff happening. The reading finally finishes up by mentioning what I just said earlier about how Europe got involved in this trade and tried to move from the periphery into the center of the trade. We'll talk about that more in Unit 6 because it's really crucial as Europe starts to move into a more important place in world history. So after all that, here's a sample question for you. Again, these are really typical questions to have on the AP test. And it says, analyze similarities and differences in two of the following trade networks in the period 600 to 1450 CE. Your response may include examples of biological, commercial, or cultural exchanges, and then you get to choose two of these, either the Indian Ocean Network, the Silk Roads, or the Trans-Saharan Network. So take a few minutes to think about this question, try writing a thesis, think about what sort of evidence you might use, and you might want to pause the video here because in a few seconds I'm going to go on and talk about the answers. At this point, I'm guessing you're ready to talk about some possible answers to the AP question. So I'm going to move ahead to the next slide. So this slide is a little crazy. It's got a lot of information on it. I basically tried to make a chart that breaks down the three trade networks and then breaks down the three categories of things that the question said you could work on: biological, commercial, cultural. I wouldn't really expect you to do this question this way unless you had a lot of extra time on the AP test. You might just want to pick the two things right away and then start working on figuring out a similarity and a difference. But I wanted to show a longer, more organized way of thinking about it. That first category, biological, is about what kinds of domesticated things were transported, I would say. Animals, plants, disease. So I made a list there of different things. There's nothing super interesting. A lot of this is borrowed from Southernization. The Silk Roads definitely pushed the plague along as well. We didn't talk about the Black Plague a ton this year, but it definitely moved from Central Asia into the Middle East and Europe on the Silk Roads. Commercial things are what sorts of goods were traded. In all three of these regions, there's a real focus on luxury goods, and the reason for that is that these societies that developed basically had to produce everything that was essential within their borders or close to it. Otherwise, they just couldn't survive. They couldn't import tons and tons of food. It just didn't work. There wasn't enough power to do that. There's no steamships, there's no railroads, there's no way to get all this stuff where it needs to go. So the things that were getting produced were luxury goods. And depending on what trade route you're on, there's maybe some different luxury goods, but the basic principle is that people who are elite members of various societies want this stuff to show their status. And then the cultural piece at the bottom, basically, I focus mostly on religion. There's some stuff around math. Language is maybe another interesting thing to look at there. For any of these questions where you have to define a similarity and a difference, I think you're going to find when you pick that either it becomes harder to find the similarity or harder to find the difference. And when I looked at this chart when I was done with it, I felt like it was hard to really get at the differences between the Indian Ocean trade and the Silk Road trade. You could definitely talk about how it was easier to transport more goods on the Indian Ocean network than the Silk Roads, but a lot of the stuff was fairly similar because they're taking stuff to and from a lot of the same places. The Trans-Saharan trade is really different, so I thought I would focus on that. And so the similarity that I thought was just the most obvious, and you really, when you're answering these, you don't want to come up with some crazy answer. Picking the most obvious thing is good, the thing that's easy to talk about. So I thought I would talk about the luxury goods. That's what's being transported in all of these things. So if I compare the Silk Roads and the Trans-Saharan trade, in both cases, we're just talking about luxury goods being traded for the most part. We're talking about silks and gold and silver and cotton textiles, talking about ivory, salt, all of this stuff is being traded. And then I thought the big difference between these is the route that the trade network takes. The Silk Roads are much longer. They connect a much greater expanse of land. And what that means is they spread a greater variety of cultural practices. I think it's pretty easy from looking at this chart to see that the main cultural practice that got spread as a result of the Trans-Saharan trade was Islam moving into Africa. However, when you look at the Silk Roads, you see that it's not just Islam that's being spread, it's also Buddhism moving from India into China. There's also the spread of things like mathematics moving from India into the Middle East and then eventually into Europe. And so there's just a greater degree of cultural interaction, I think. And part of the reason for that is that the Sahara Desert is a really intense barrier to trade. And the fact that it happened at all in some ways is kind of remarkable, and we have camels to thank for that. The Silk Roads connect just tons and tons and tons of different people and places. The continuity, or another similarity that you could potentially write about, is the importance of Islamic traders in all of these routes. And that Islam was one of the major three portable religions, but it was the one that looked most favorably upon economics and trade. And so a lot of times you'd have Islamic merchants, Muslim merchants going to these trading posts, and so they would be spreading religion along with whatever they were buying and selling. And that's how you end up with this incredible spread of Islam throughout Afro-Eurasia in the time after 600 CE. I hope this video was helpful. There's a lot of important stuff in this unit, and I hope you enjoy the next video on Unit 4.